Deaf rancher won a failing print shop for 30 cents. 4 girls ran the press. The 30 cents were still in my pocket the morning I walked through that door. I don't know why I kept them, 3 dimes. I'd rolled them out of my vest pocket onto the card table the night before without even thinking about it, the way you toss your last grain of tobacco into a pipe just to have something to do with your hands. Didn't know what I was betting against. Turned out it was a deed. Turned out I won. That was November. Cold enough that the mud in the street had stopped being mud and was just frozen ruts again, and you could hear, if you could hear, the way boots cracked through the thin ice crust on the puddles. I couldn't hear that. Haven't heard much of anything since I was 32 years old, and a rifle went off 6 inches from my left ear during a cattle dispute that turned ugly near the Cimarron River. High summer, that was. By autumn I was mostly running on what I could read off a man's face, and what vibration came up through the floorboards when a door slammed. I could still hear some. Low sounds. A big wagon wheel on hard-packed dirt came up through my boot soles. Thunder sometimes. A woman screaming. I'd learned to pay attention to what my body told me about the world because my ears weren't doing the job anymore. Anyway, November. The deed said, the KESSLER Family Printing Company, Lot 14, 2nd Street. And below that, in a different ink, smaller, Est 1881. Assets, 1 Chandler and Price Platen Press 10x15, 1 compositing table, 1 lead type cabinet partial, sundry tools and materials. Indebtedness, see attached schedule. I didn't read the attached schedule until I was already there. The building was a narrow thing squeezed between a dry goods store and a saddle maker. 2 windows in front, both grimy. I could see light inside. I stood on the boardwalk for a minute with my hand on the door handle. It was cold enough that the iron bit through my glove, and then I felt the vibration of something mechanical running inside. Press, I thought. Somebody's running that press. I went in. 4 girls. That was the first thing. The oldest one was maybe 19. Dark-haired, flower-pale the way people go when they've been working inside all winter and not eating enough. And she was standing at the compositing table pulling individual type letters out of a stick with the speed of somebody who's been doing it since before she could reach the table without a box to stand on. The second was maybe 16, feeding paper into the platen press, 1 sheet at a time, her whole body slightly forward like she was listening to the machine. The other 2, twins, I guessed, maybe 12, were doing some kind of hand sorting at a table in the back. And even from the door I could see the type was upside down and backwards the way it needs to be, and their fingers moved through it like they could read it that way without thinking. They didn't notice me come in. I stood there and watched the press do its cycle. I'd never been inside a print shop in my life. I'd spent 20 years running cattle and the decade before that doing work that wasn't worth describing to polite company. But I'd picked up things. You watch enough men work, you start to understand the language of it, what's easy, what's not, what's being done right. That press was being fed right. The girl at it had a rhythm, and the print was landing clean, and the whole operation had the look of people who knew their business. Then the oldest one looked up and saw me. She didn't smile, she didn't look scared. She put down the compositing stick and walked toward me, and I watched her face the whole way. It was a thing I'd gotten good at, reading faces. And what I saw there was the particular expression of a person who is very tired and has decided to be done being afraid. Past afraid. Around the bend and out the other side into something harder. She said something. Her mouth made words. I watched her, but I'd lost the thread because she was talking before she was close enough for me to see clearly. I pointed at my ear. She stopped. Then she tried again, slower, and I read it off her. You'll hear about the deed. I nodded. She held out her hand. She wanted to see it. I pulled it from my pocket and unfolded it and held it out. She took it and read it without any change in her face, and then she folded it back up and held it out to me. She said, my father died in August. We've been running it since. I watched her say it the same way you watch a fire you're not sure yet is in control. There wasn't grief in it. There was just fact. I looked around the shop. It was cleaner than it had any right to be, and the press was still running behind her, the 16-year-old still feeding it, not looking at us, and the twins in back had gone quiet but not stopped working. I put the deed back in my pocket and held out my hand. My name is Cal Briggs, I said, speaking slow the way I'd learned to, so people could understand me when they needed to. My voice had gotten strange in the years since I went mostly deaf. I knew that much, even if I couldn't hear it myself. People's faces told me when it was too loud or too flat. Her face didn't do either of those things. She shook my hand, firm. "Margaret Kessler," she said. That was the beginning of it. I should back up some because there are things you need to know about what came before, and I can tell them faster than I lived them. I had a ranch, 22 miles north of town, up where the land flattens out and the grass runs long in the spring, and the winters come in mean from the northwest. I'd built it up from nothing, bought 40 acres in '79, picked up another 60 in '84 when a neighbor went under, borrowed money I didn't have to improve the water situation, paid it back. By the time I was 40, I had something that worked. Not big, but solid. Solid in the way that only things you've sweated over and patched and worried about in the small hours can be. My wife had died in '87, fever that came on fast and didn't leave. Clara, I don't talk about Clara much. She deserves better than being summed up in a few sentences, so I'll only say she was the kind of woman who made everything around her more real, more particular, and when she was gone the world went flat, not painful, just flat. And I kept on in it because there wasn't any other option. I hired a man to run the ranch in the fall of '91, and I came to town because a doctor in town had told me back in the spring that my knee, the one a horse had disagreed with in '88, was going to quit on me by winter if I didn't give it some rest. I didn't believe him. I came to town more because I was tired in a way that the ranch couldn't fix, and I thought different walls might help. It didn't really help. I played cards some. I ate in the hotel. I thought about going back in a few weeks. Then there was the card game and the 30 cents, and the deed to the Kessler family printing company. I hadn't meant to bet. I'd sat down with 3 other men and bought in for $2 and played respectably for a couple of hours, winning a little and losing a little in the way that keeps a game comfortable. Then one of the men, stocky fellow, surveyor, full of a kind of confidence that comes from knowing one thing very well, he pushed a folded piece of paper into the pot. I watched the others react to it. Surprise and then something else. Calculation. The kind you see when a man is looking at a problem. I folded on that hand, but the surveyor won it, and then on the very next hand he put the paper in again, same play, as if it was a lucky token instead of a deed to a piece of property. I'd seen that before, men who win something and immediately want to risk it because what they really want is the winning, not the thing. That hand I did not fold. I didn't win so much as the other men lost. By the end of it, there were 3 dimes and a deed in front of me, and the surveyor was shaking his head with the particular rueful expression of a man who is not going to take the lesson. I didn't know that night that there were 4 girls keeping the lights on in that building. I found out in the morning. Margaret walked me through the shop that first day the way a general walks you through a position he's been holding against better odds than he should have been able to manage. Not boasting. Just, here is the situation, here are the facts. Draw your own conclusions. The press was a 10x15 Chandler and Price from 1882. Good machine. The previous 10 years had been kind to it in terms of use and hard on it in terms of maintenance, and the result was a machine that ran and would run until the day it didn't, and that day was coming. She showed me the worn roller, showed me where the gripper had been bent back and straightened twice and was going to need replacing. She used her hands to show me what she meant and pointed at the parts, and I followed well enough. The type was partial. A good portion of the Roman face had been picked clean over years of small jobs and never replaced, so some letters they simply didn't have and had to work around. The youngest twins, Dottie and Faye, as I learned, had developed a system for this. They showed me without being asked. Little card with a list of the letters they were short on and a set of substitution rules. Certain letters could be filed to stand in for others if you knew what you were doing. Clara, I mean Dottie, I was already mixing the names up in my head and I hated myself for it, showed me the filed-down H that could read as an N in certain type sizes from certain distances. Smart work. The 16-year-old was Hazel. She was the one who understood the press the way some people understand horses, through her hands and her body, not through words. She could feel when the impression was going to be off before it happened. She didn't talk much and didn't need to. And then there was the debt schedule. Margaret sat me down at the compositing table with the schedule and a lamp between us. The building was rented, $72 a year, paid quarterly, and the last quarter had not been paid. There were 2 outstanding balances with paper suppliers. There was a note at the First National for $140 that had been their father's and was now technically the estate's, except there wasn't any estate. There was a bill at the dry goods store next door, Harding's, for $11, and some sense that Margaret had let go because the paper bill was more urgent. She laid all this out without embarrassment and without apology, just laid it out. I said slowly so she could follow, "What were you printing?" "Handbills mostly," she said, "notices. Small jobs for the merchants in town. We had the contract for the Territorial Gazette, that's the weekly paper, but a man named Sutter bought a press of his own in September, and he does it for less." I watched her say Sutter's name. The way her jaw moved on it told me a good deal about Sutter. "What does a week of handbills bring in?" I asked. $4 if it's a good week, sometimes two. I thought about that. The note at the bank was accruing interest. The rent quarter was already overdue. The paper bill would stop the operation entirely if not paid. $4 a week against all of that was not a number that added up. "How long have you been making it work?" I asked. She looked at me for a moment. "Since August," she said, "about 3 months. 3 months of $4 weeks and no father, and a machine that was wearing itself down, and 3 younger sisters to keep fed." I let that sit. "What were you planning to do?" I said, before I walked in. Her face did something then that I didn't have a name for at the time. It wasn't defeat and it wasn't defiance. It was something between the two, a thing compressed by being held in for a long time. "Keep going," she said, until I couldn't. I went back to the hotel and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the deed and thought. I want to be honest about what I was thinking. I was not thinking about Margaret Kessler, not exactly. I was thinking about the press running and the 4 girls working and the particular quality of competence I'd seen in that building, the kind that doesn't get credit because it's female and young and in a place where people expect failure. I was thinking about the type filing and the substitution card and Hazel feeding paper with her whole body slightly forward. I was thinking about $72 a year in rent and $4 weeks and a machine that needed a new roller. I was also thinking, and I knew it even then, knew it the way you know when a weather change is coming, that I had come to town to find something to do with myself, and here was something to do with myself. I went back in the morning with a piece of paper. I'd written it out at the hotel desk, because it was easier than trying to talk and watch at the same time. The piece of paper said, "I own the building now, not the rent note. I am not going to collect rent. I am going to pay off the paper suppliers and the bank note. What I want in return is to learn the business and to be useful here while I figure out what to do with the property." Margaret read it twice, then she looked at me. She said, "Why?" I said, "I've got money sitting doing nothing, and you've got a working operation that needs capital. That's not charity, it's sense." She looked at the paper again. Then she said, "You want to learn to set type." I said, "I want to learn everything." She thought about that for a moment, and then she said, and I watched every word form, one at a time, because I didn't want to miss any of it, "I'll teach you. But you'll need to tell me when you don't understand something. I can't always tell when you've lost the thread." "Fair enough," I said. She gave me a small nod, not warm exactly, but real. The first weeks were hard in a way I hadn't expected. I'd spent 20 years managing men who had opinions about being managed, and I'd gotten decent at it. I knew how to read a situation, how to be quiet at the right moment, how to give a man enough room to think a thing was his own idea. I wasn't inexperienced with difficulty. But typesetting is a particular kind of work. You're working backward and upside down, and you're working fast, and the speed matters because a job that takes 3 hours instead of 2 hours is a job that earns less per hour, and the margins are what they are. Dottie and Faye had grown up with their hands in that type case, and their fingers knew where every letter lived without the eyes being involved. Mine didn't. I kept reaching for the lowercase e, and grabbing the C, I kept dropping things. Hazel was the one who taught me the press. She did it entirely without words. She'd do a thing, then step back and let me do it. And if I did it wrong, she'd take my hand and move it to the right place. She was 16 years old, and she had the patient authority of someone who has only ever been understood through demonstration. Twice she caught something I was about to do wrong and stopped my hand before the machine could punish me for it. She had reflexes built around that press the way a rider builds reflexes around a horse, anticipating, compensating, always a half-second ahead. Margaret managed the business. Orders, billing, pickups, deliveries, the conversation with the First National when I came in as the new note holder. She had a book where she kept everything, not just money, but notes on what each customer wanted, how they'd reacted to previous work, what they were likely to need. Her father had started the book and she'd continued it, and somewhere in the middle the handwriting changed from a man's rounded script to a woman's more vertical one. And that was August, that change in the handwriting. I watched her at the compositing table some evenings when the light was going and the girls had gone home. They lived 2 streets over, in a house they were renting month to month from a widow named Colfax who'd been extending grace because she'd liked their father. Margaret would stay late, making up the type for the next morning's jobs, and I would stay because I was still learning, and there was always something to learn. One night she stopped mid-stick and looked at me. She said, "Does it bother you, not hearing things?" I thought about how to answer. I said, "Used to. Now it's just how things are." She went back to the type for a moment, then stopped again. She said, "I didn't hear my father come home the night he died. He came in late. He'd been to see the bank. I was asleep. In the morning he was gone. I think about that." I watched her say it. She said it to the type, not to me. When she finished, she looked up and I said, "You think you might have done something different?" She said, "I think I might have heard something was wrong." I said, "Or he didn't want you to hear it. Some things a man carries alone because he loves you." Her face did that thing again, the compressed thing. Then she went back to the type and I went back to watching her hands. I paid the note at the First National in early December. The banker, a man named Eakins, was not unfriendly, but was the particular kind of formal that men of that position use when they want to make you understand the favor they're doing you by dealing with you at all. He explained the terms to me as if I might not follow. I let him. I'd learned a long time ago that men who need to feel smarter than you will work themselves out of your way faster if you let them get it out of their system. I paid the paper suppliers. I told them the Kessler shop had new capital and would be needing regular deliveries. Then I went to find Sutter. Sutter had his operation in a larger building on Main Street, and his press was a bigger Gordon, which was a better machine than the Chandler and Price. And he had a man working the press for him while he stood at a desk in the front, and did the look of a prosperous businessman with the specific energy of a man who'd recently become one and hadn't gotten bored of it yet. He recognized me when I came in. We'd met once, briefly, at the hotel bar. He was one of those men who remembers faces when there might be something in it for him. I said, "You've got the Gazette contract." He said, "That's right." I said, "What are you charging?" He named a figure. It was lower than it should have been, low enough that he was probably taking a loss on it to establish the relationship, planning to raise it once he had them locked in. I said, "We'll do it for less, and we'll do it better." He looked at me the way men sometimes look at me when they realize I'm not entirely what I appeared to be. The deafness tends to let men underestimate you at first. I'd learned to use that. He said, "The Kessler girls can't turn the Gazette around in a night. That's what the contract requires." I said, "We can now. Come see the shop." He didn't come see the shop, but he didn't dismiss it entirely either. I could tell from the slight tightening around his eyes that I'd found something he hadn't expected to have to think about. I went back and told Margaret. She was quiet for a long time, not because she didn't understand, but because she was thinking something through. Then she said, "One night run means Hazel is here past midnight." I said, "I'll be here. I'll run the press." She said, "You don't know the press well enough yet for a full run." She was right, I said, "Then teach me faster." She held my gaze for a moment. Then something moved behind her eyes, not quite a smile, more the echo of one, and she said, "All right." The teaching went faster after that. Margaret was a good teacher when she decided to be, which she had not entirely decided to be in the first weeks. She'd been watching me. I understood that now, watching to see what I was and wasn't, the way you watch a tool you've been handed that you didn't choose yourself to see if it's worth the trouble. Now she decided. And what changed was that she talked to me the way she talked to her sisters, directly, not explaining twice, assuming that I would figure out the second half of the thing myself and come back with questions if I didn't. That was the way a person talks to someone they've made up their mind about. She taught me the registration, how to line up the sheet so the impression fell where it was supposed to. She taught me how to feel the roller for ink distribution the way Hazel had taught me to feel the impression, through the hands, and that was easy for me because I'd been doing everything through my hands for years and they were good at it. She taught me the timing of the feed, the particular rhythm that let you go fast without making mistakes. The twins taught me the case. Dottie, who was, in fact, the quieter and more precise of the two, not the lively one as I'd initially gotten them confused, took me through the California job case, drawer by drawer, until I could close my eyes and reach for an E and find the E. This took about 2 weeks. It took me 2 weeks because I am stubborn and she was patient, and the combination of stubbornness and patience will get almost anything done eventually. Faye was the livelier one, and the one who understood the machinery of language the way Hazel understood the machinery of the press. She was the one who'd come to Margaret with a sentence that used no H's and no N's and still said exactly what the customer wanted when they were short on those letters. She was 12 years old and she was a natural editor and didn't know it yet. I started writing some of the copy myself. Handbills, mostly. A merchant wanted a notice about a winter goods sale, and his text was muddy, and I rewrote it, and he sold out of his long coats in 4 days and came back wanting more. Margaret saw that and added it to her book, next to the man's name. Things were working, slowly but working. And then came January, and the thing with the Townsman. The Townsman was not the Gazette. The Gazette was the weekly that old Denny Aldrich had been running out of Sutter's press, and the Gazette was fine. It was a respectable small-town paper. It had been running for 6 years, and it would run for another 20. The Townsman was something different. It was a notion that a man named Prout had Aldrich's former assistant, a young man with opinions and ink in his blood and not enough money, to start a second paper, a more opinionated one that would say things the Gazette was too comfortable to say. Prout came to us because Sutter had refused him. Probably Sutter had refused him because Aldrich had asked him to, and Sutter needed Aldrich's goodwill more than he needed Prout's business. We didn't need anyone's goodwill yet. We needed work. I was alone in the shop when Prout came in. Margaret had taken the twins to buy boots. Hazel was there, but she was changing out the roller, a new one finally that I'd ordered, and her hands were full of a job that didn't allow for interruption. Prout was 23, maybe, and he had the specific energy of a young man who has a thing he believes in and has been told no twice and has decided that's going to make him try harder. He talked fast and I lost him pretty quickly, so I held up a hand and pointed at my ear, and he took that in, and then he looked around the shop and found a pencil on the compositing table and grabbed it and wrote on the back of his hand, "I want to print a newspaper." I said, "We do that." He wrote, "Aldrich won't like it." I said, "Who's our landlord?" He blinked. He hadn't thought it through that way. I said, "What's your run?" He held up both hands twice. 20 copies to start. That was nothing. 20 copies was a morning's work. But it was also the beginning of something, and I'd been in enough early situations to know what an early situation looked like. I wrote, "Come back with your copy. We'll do a proof run free. If you like it, we talk price." He looked at what I'd written, and then he looked at me, and then he looked around the shop again. And I saw him see it the way I'd seen it on that first day. 4 girls running a print shop. Not failing, actually working, and something in him settled. He came back the next day with 12 pages of close-written manuscript. Margaret read the manuscript that evening. I watched her face while she read, and I watched her expressions go through a short range. Interest, then something sharpening, then a kind of suppressed animation. When she finished, she looked at me and said, "This is good." I said I thought so too. She said, "Aldrich is going to be furious." I said, "That's Prout's problem." She said, "It becomes our problem if Aldrich sends work elsewhere." I said, "Aldrich will send work elsewhere if Sutter gives him a reason to stay or we give him a reason to switch. We can give him a reason to switch." She thought about that. Then she said, "You're not afraid of much, are you?" I said, "I'm afraid of plenty. I just don't find it useful to organize my decisions around it." She looked at me for a moment, really looked at me, the way she hadn't entirely done before, the straight, clear look she turned on things she was figuring out, and then she said, "My father was like that." I didn't say anything. Sometimes when someone offers you something like that, the right response is just to receive it quietly. She turned back to the manuscript. She said, "We can set this in 2 evenings. If we run it Saturday, we can have it on the street Sunday morning." That was how the Kessler shop printed the first issue of the Millhaven Townsman. The response to the Townsman was not a simple thing. Some people in town thought it was about time someone said what Prout was saying. Prut had opinions about the Territorial Land Commission, and about the water rights situation north of town, and about a judge whose decisions had been convenient in ways that seemed to track too closely with who was paying for his church pew. These were things people knew and people didn't say out loud, and Prut said them out loud in calm, precise sentences with specific examples, and not a great deal of inflammatory language, which made it harder to dismiss than if he'd been ranting. Some people were unhappy. Aldrich was unhappy. The judge was unhappy. A man whose nephew sat on the land commission and who was himself somewhat invested in how those land decisions went was extremely unhappy, and he came to our shop, and he was the kind of unhappy that comes with size and volume, and the specific expectation that size and volume will solve the problem. His name was Corbett. He came in on a Tuesday. I was setting type at the compositing table, and Margaret was doing the books at the desk in the back, and Hazel was at the press, and the twins were at school. I didn't hear him come in, so the first I knew about it was Hazel stopping the press and looking toward the front. And then I looked, and there was a very large man in a buffalo coat standing in the shop with his hat still on. I read his face. He was not quite angry yet. He was at the point just before it where a man still thinks he can get what he wants through authority rather than force, and so he was performing authority. Straight posture, flat look. He said something to me. I watched his mouth and caught most of it. He was asking who was in charge. I said, I am. He said something else. I caught, stop printing that rag. I said, I'm sorry, you'll need to speak slowly. I don't hear well. He said it again, slower, and I got more of it. He was not asking. He was telling me. I said, Mr. Prut is our customer. What he prints is his business, not ours. He moved toward me, not quickly. The way a large thing moves when it wants you to understand that it could move quickly but is choosing not to yet. And then Margaret was there. She had come from the back and she was standing beside me, not in front of me, not protecting me, but beside me, and her face had done the thing I'd seen it do before. Past afraid, the other side of afraid, the compressed thing. Except now it wasn't compressed. It was open. She said something I didn't catch fully because she was turned partly away from me. But I caught the last of it, which was, and if you touch that man or this equipment, I will go directly to Sheriff Braden and the county judge in Caldwell, and I will tell them exactly what was threatened in this shop today, and I will put it in the paper. Corbett looked at her. Then he looked at me. Then he looked around the shop. I think he was doing what everyone did the first time they were really here, really looking, and he made a calculation that I suspect surprised him, and he left. When he was gone, Margaret turned to me. She said, I hope that was all right. I said it was more than all right. She said, he'll be back. I said, maybe, but now he knows what the cost is. She looked at me steadily for a moment. She was close enough that I could see the small things in her face. She was tired, and she'd been frightened, and under both of those things was something that was not tired and not frightened, something that had been there for a while. I thought, she is 20 years younger than I am, and she has 3 sisters depending on her, and she is standing here next to me as if it is a natural place to stand. I turned back to the compositing table. I heard, or felt really, through the floor, Hazel starting the press again. February was a good month. The Townsman ran 3 issues and picked up 42 paid subscribers, which was better than Prut had dared to think and better than I'd expected, though I'd expected better than Prut had. We picked up 2 new regular accounts. A dry goods merchant named Holt who'd seen what we'd done for Harding next door, and the county commission, which needed minutes and notifications printed and had been paying Sutter a figure that I was able to undercut while still making it worth our while. The new roller on the press made a difference. Hazel showed me the before and after in the impression quality on 2 sheets of the same text. The old impression had a slight fade on the left margin that you had to look for, and the new one was even all the way across. And she held up the 2 sheets side by side with an expression that I'd learned to read as pride on her, which on anyone else might have looked like nothing at all. The twins were getting faster. Dottie had started teaching Faye some of what she knew about the compositing. Dottie was by nature the teacher and Faye the one who needed to be taught, and then immediately exceeded what she'd been taught, which is a good combination in a pair. And some evenings I'd look up from what I was doing, and the 2 of them would be running a small job entirely on their own, start to finish, with that particular quality of focus that children have when they are doing a real thing, and they know it. I wrote to my hired man at the ranch. I told him I'd be staying through spring at least. He wrote back to say the cattle were fine and to not worry, which I appreciated. I didn't entirely not worry, but I found I was worrying about the ranch less than I'd expected to. One evening in the middle of February, after the others had gone, I was cleaning the type case, putting letters back in the right drawers, which was tedious but necessary, and which I'd made my particular job because I was the slowest at the case, and cleaning gave me practice. And Margaret came from the back and set a plate on the compositing table next to me. Bread and cold meat, and something in a small jar that turned out to be apple butter. She sat down on the stool across from me with her own plate. I said, "You don't have to feed me." She said, "You work until 9 every night and you eat at the hotel. And I know what they serve at the hotel because Holt has the supply contract, and I do Holt's notices." I said, "What's wrong with what they serve?" She said, "Nothing if you don't mind mutton every third night." I ate the bread and the cold meat and the apple butter, and she ate across from me, and we didn't talk for a while, which was unusual. Margaret always had something to say, and I watched her not talking for a while, and then I said, "What are you thinking about?" She said, "My father's handwriting." I waited. She said, "I was looking at the book today, the record book. I was going to make a new entry for the commission contract, and I looked at the old entries and I thought about how I can read all of them, even the ones from before I could read. I know what his handwriting looks like on a word I've never seen before, and I thought, it's strange to know someone that well and have them just be gone." I said, "It doesn't stop being strange." She said, "Is that from experience?" I said, "Yes." She didn't ask me to say more. That was one of the things about her, she didn't push. She'd ask a question and then let you answer it as much as you wanted to and stop when you stopped. I said, "My wife died in '87. She said, "I'm sorry." I said she'd have liked this, the shop. She had a practical mind, she liked things that worked. Margaret was quiet for a moment, eating. Then she said, "What was her name?" I said, "Clara." She said, "Clara," and she said it the way you say a name when you're putting it somewhere you'll keep it. We ate the rest of it, and then she washed the plates in the small basin in the back, and I finished with the type case, and we went home in our separate directions in the cold. March came in with a week of snow that shut the streets down and kept customers away, and then it cleared and the mud came back and the customers came back with it. And by the middle of March, we were running the press 6 days out of 7, and I was setting type with my eyes closed, not literally, but nearly. My hands had learned it. Not as fast as the girls, not yet, but fast enough to be useful, and I was doing less damage to the case than I had been. And once I stopped damaging the case, I stopped being a liability and started being an asset. The townsman was causing trouble, which was what the townsman was supposed to do. Pruitt had a piece in the March issue about the water rights situation that named 3 men by name and cited documents that he'd gotten from the county recorder's office. And one of those men was prominent enough that the piece got read in places beyond Millhaven. Corbett came back, not to the shop, to me on the street. He came out of the hardware store as I was passing and stepped into my path. I stopped. He said things I didn't catch. His face was different from the first time. The authority performance was gone, replaced with something more direct, more personal. I waited until he was done, and then I said, "I'd ask you to slow down, I don't hear well." He said it again, slower, and I got most of it. He was telling me that I was going to regret backing Pruitt. That a man in my position, and here he paused to make sure I understood what he meant by my position, which was a man with a ranch and assets, which was also a man who had something to lose, would be smart to think about what he was making himself part of. I let him finish. Then I said, "I appreciate the concern." I walked around him and went on my way. I didn't tell Margaret about it right away. I thought about it that evening and decided it wasn't something she needed to worry about. And then I thought about whether I was keeping it from her because she didn't need to know or because I didn't want to see the expression on her face when she did. And that question didn't have a comfortable answer. The next evening she came in from an errand and sat down and said, "Corbett told Holt not to use us." I said, "What did Holt say?" She said, "Holt said he'd think about it. I talked to him this afternoon." I said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "I told him we'd never missed a deadline and Sutter had missed 2 in 6 months. And I showed him the impression quality difference on 2 sheets. And I told him that the townsman was going to keep running until Pruitt couldn't afford it or ran out of things to say. and that when it was done, it would have been the paper that got the water rights problem looked at by people who could actually fix it, and that in 5 years, Holt was going to want to be on the right side of that story. I looked at her. She said, "He's staying with us." I said, "You're good at this." She said, "My father was good at it. I watched him for a long time." I said, "Watching isn't all of it." She looked at me. She said, "No, it isn't." April. The shop was running well enough that I started thinking about what it needed to become if it was going to be stable for the long term. Not just stable, worth having. A machine that worked on its own. Margaret was close to that already. She'd been building it for months, and what she'd been building it into was a version of herself, which was disciplined and economical and harder to knock over than it looked. But there were things that needed money. The type case needed to be completed. The missing letters needed to be filled in, which meant ordering from the type foundry in Kansas City, which meant $120 I hadn't spent because there had been more urgent things to spend money on. There was a job press, a smaller machine for cards and short notices, that I'd been watching at the hardware man's back lot for 2 months, something a bankrupt printer in Dodge City had left as partial payment on a debt, and the hardware man wanted $35 for it. It was worth $60, but $35 was $35. I bought the job press first because it was simpler. Hazel and I collected it from the back lot on a Saturday morning with a rented wagon. It was heavier than it had any right to be, and loading it was a project, and Hazel had opinions about how to do it that she communicated entirely through hand signals and one sharp exclamation that I didn't hear but understood from the expression, which was, "Not that way." We did it her way and got it loaded. We got it into the shop and set up by noon. The twins were there by then, and they circled the little press the way dogs circle something new, interested, not quite ready to commit. Faye reached out and touched the platen. Hazel showed her the feed lever. Margaret came in at some point while we were getting it leveled and stood in the doorway for a moment watching, and I didn't see her come in, so I didn't know she was there until I happened to look up and she was just there, watching the 4 of us with the new press, and her face had an expression on it that I'd never seen on her before. Not the compressed thing, not the tired thing, something open and still like a field after rain. I held up a hand to the twins and walked over. She said, "You bought a job press." I said, "Waste not." She said, "You've been watching that press for 2 months." I said, "Hardware man wanted $35. She said, "It's worth $60. I said, "That's what I thought." She looked at me for a long moment. She said, "How much more are you going to put into this place?" I said, "Whatever it needs." She said, "Why?" I thought about how to answer that. I'd gotten better in the months we'd been working together at understanding what she was really asking when she asked a question. She wasn't asking about the money. She was asking something more particular than that. I said, "I told you at the start. You had a working operation that needed capital." She said, "That was 4 months ago. This isn't about capital anymore." She was right, it wasn't. But I wasn't certain I was ready to say out loud what it was about, and she seemed to understand that because she didn't push. She looked back at the press and then at the twins, who had gone back to examining it, and she said quietly without looking at me, "Thank you for the job press." I said, "Thank Margaret from me." She looked at me puzzled. I said, "That's something Clara used to say. When I did something right, she'd say thank you and I'd say to thank Clara." Her face went still, not sad still. She said, "Thank you, Clara." I looked away at the press. I felt Hazel starting the big Chandler and Price in the back, running a test impression after the move to make sure nothing had shifted. May. A federal land surveyor came through town and stayed a week. He was looking at the water rights situation, and Prout had an interview with him that ran in the Townsman on a Thursday, and by Friday the interview had been read by enough people that the county commissioner from Caldwell had sent a letter asking for a copy of the relevant filing documents. Corbett, as far as I could tell, went quiet. The type case was complete by the 2nd week of May. Kansas City type, fresh cast, every character present. Dottie ran her hand over the new letters the day they arrived with the expression of a craftsman receiving good tools. On a Sunday afternoon in late May, a warm one, the kind of warm that comes in from the south and carries the smell of grass starting to come back. I was sitting on the bench outside the shop doing nothing in particular, resting, which I'd gotten better at, and Margaret came and sat beside me. We'd been working together for 6 months. She didn't say anything for a while, and neither did I. And I watched the street instead of her face, which was a thing I was rarely able to do when she was talking because reading her meant watching her face. But now there was nothing to read, so I could just look at the street, the mud drying out in the warmth, a dog crossing deliberately in the direction of something it had decided on, a boy and a girl, 10 or 11 maybe, having an argument about something near the livery, animated but not serious. I felt her shift beside me. Not toward me, just settling, the way a person settles into a place they've decided to stay in for a while. I said, "I've been thinking about something." She said, "What?" I said, "The ranch. My hired man has been running it on his own, and he's a good man. But it's mine, and I should spend some time there. Go up in June, come back in September." She said, "That makes sense." I said, "I want to make sure the shop is set up so it can run without me before I go." She said, "It's been running with you providing capital and learning to set type. Those aren't the same thing as running the shop." I said, "I know, but you've been running the shop since August. You were running it before I got here." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "We were barely running it." I said, "You were running it, you just didn't have enough to run it well. Now you do." She said, "Some of that's you." I said, "Some of it, you'd have found something else." She said, "Maybe, maybe not." A wagon went past in the street, slow, going somewhere it wasn't in a hurry to get to. I felt it through the bench. She said, "What happens when you come back in September?" I said, "I keep working here, if you'll have me." She said, "As a partner." I said, "If that's what you want to call it." "I don't need a title." She said, "What do you need?" I thought about that honestly. I said, "To be useful, to be somewhere that makes sense." She said, "This place makes sense to you." I said, "More than anything has in a while." She was quiet again, long enough that I looked at her, and she was looking at the street, not at me, and her face was doing the open, still thing that I'd started to recognize as what she looked like when she was thinking something all the way through before she committed to it. Then she turned to me. She said, "When you come back in September, come back to the shop, and also—" She stopped, started again. She said, "Also come back to us, not just as a partner, as I don't know what word to use, but come back the way someone comes back who belongs somewhere." I looked at her. She was looking straight at me, the direct look she had, the one that didn't manage itself. I said, "I'll come back that way." She said, "All right." She didn't reach for my hand, and I didn't reach for hers. But she stayed on the bench beside me for a while longer, both of us in the warmth, and the dog came back across the street going the other direction, having sorted out whatever it had gone to sort out, and the twins came out of somewhere. They'd been at the Widow Colfax's, I think, and came running down the boardwalk and stopped short when they saw us sitting there. And Dottie said something that I didn't catch, and Faye said something, and they both looked at each other, and then went into the shop without saying anything to us, which seemed to mean something. Margaret stood up after a while and went inside. I stayed on the bench a little longer. The warmth was good on my bad knee. I thought about Clara, not with grief, not exactly. The flat world feeling I'd been carrying since '87 was different now. Not gone, but interrupted by something. By a shop with 4 girls in it and a woman who had stood beside me when she didn't have to and who had said, "Come back the way someone comes back who belongs somewhere." I thought about the 30 cents in my pocket, still there. I'd meant to do something with them, put them away somewhere, or spend them, or give them to the twins for candy. But they kept staying in the pocket. I was gone 90 days. The ranch was fine. Grass had come in well that spring, and the water was good, and my hired man had done everything right, and the cattle were in the condition they should be in, and the fences were where they should be. I worked, and it was good to work with my hands in the open, the way I'd always worked. But now there was a thing in my mind that hadn't been there before, not a longing exactly, more like knowing something was waiting. The way you know the cold is coming and you're comfortable enough for now, but the knowing is always there. I wrote to Margaret. I had not expected to be a man who wrote letters, but I found I had things to say. Not important things, observations, questions about how the shop was doing, an account of a late summer storm that had come through and the way it had looked. She wrote back, and her letters were like her talking. Direct, specific, often funny in a way that I'd come to recognize as entirely her own, a kind of dry precision that made things funnier by not signaling that they were funny. In one letter, she told me that Prout's water rights story had resulted in an actual commission review, and 2 of the 3 men named in the piece had been removed from their positions, which Prout had reported in the Townsman with the specific restraint of someone who wanted to crow, but knew that crowing would undermine the thing he'd built, and that his subscription count was at 104. In another letter, she told me that Hazel had done a full overnight press run entirely on her own. Prout needed a rush job, and Margaret had been sick, and Hazel had simply done it, beginning to end, and the product was excellent. And when Hazel presented her with the finished copies the next morning, all she'd done was nod once, and then go back to making sure the type was cleaned and returned. In the last letter before I came back, she wrote, "We have a job press, a complete type case, 6 regular accounts, a newspaper contract, and 4 people who know what they're doing. I thought you should know what you're coming back to." I wrote back, "I know what I'm coming back to." September. The cottonwoods had started turning, and the mornings were cold again the way they'd been when I first walked through that door. I came into town on a Tuesday, put my horse up and went to the hotel and set down my bag. Then I walked to 2nd Street. The press was running. I could feel it from the boardwalk. The door was unlocked. I went in. Hazel at the press, one of the twins, Faye, I thought, from the way she was moving at the compositing table, the other twin visible in the back. They all looked up, and Faye said something to the back of the shop, and then Margaret came through from the back office. She was dressed for work, ink on her right hand from something she'd been setting, hair back plain. She stopped when she saw me. She said, "You're back." I said, "September." Like I said. She said, "How's the ranch?" I said, "Fine, cattle are good." She said, "Good." There was a moment. Then she walked toward me, not slowly but not hurrying, and when she was close enough she reached out and took hold of my arm, not dramatically, not like a scene from something, just the firm, practical grip of a woman who has decided something and is acting on it, her hand on my forearm, and she looked at me the way she'd looked at the proof sheets when she wanted to see whether something was right, and what was in her face was the same thing I'd been carrying around since May. She said, "Welcome back, Cal." I said, "Good to be back." Behind her, the press kept running. Faye was setting type with the particular clicking speed she'd gotten from her sister, who'd gotten it from her father. The machine thudded through the floor into my boots. Margaret's hand was still on my arm. I didn't move to take it or move to release it. I just let it be there, the weight of it, plain and specific and real, and the shop was warm from the press running, and the ink smell that I'd hated the first week and now couldn't imagine a day without was all around us. That was it, that was the whole of it. I didn't have a name yet for what I was to that place, or what I was to the woman standing in front of me with ink on her hand and her eyes steady on mine. I knew I'd find out in time, and that the finding out would be done the same way everything else had been done. In the shop, working, day after day, the small accumulation of real things. The 30 cents are on a shelf at the ranch now. I put them there when I went back in the fall, set them on the shelf above the fireplace where Clara's portrait is, where I put things I want to keep. 3 dimes. I thought I'd feel strange about that placement, the old and the new that closed together. I didn't. Clara had a practical mind. She liked things that worked. I think she'd have understood. And the press ran, and the shop ran. And outside, the cottonwoods were gold in the September light, and the mud had gone dry and cracked, and somewhere in town Prout was writing something that would make somebody uncomfortable, and we would print it clean and true because that was our job, and we were good at our job, and Margaret Kessler had made sure of that long before I walked through the door.